For me, it began in 1992 with an ending. I was 5 years old and happened upon a comic shop advertising the death of Superman in its window display. From that moment forward, the Man of Steel has been my favorite character, and now on this podcast, I'm exploring my fandom and examining the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton across media for over 80 years. Welcome to a special edition of Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I am your host, Anthony Desiato. This episode features an interview with Mark Waid, writer of Superman Birthright. Joining me to kick off this episode is my buddy, comic book artist V KEN MARION.
Yo, what's up, Anthony?
Thank you for helping me get things started here. It was an absolute blast to get to talk to Mark Waid, and I'm going to play that for our audience in just a minute. He and I spoke for just under an hour. I can honestly say I got to ask and tell him everything that I wanted to about Superman Birthright. And after the interview, you'll come back and we'll kind of unpack some of the things that he and I talked about. I think there were a few things in particular that I think will give us a good jumping off point for further discussion. But I wanted to have you on in particular because I know that, like me, this is your favorite Superman comic book story. And I wanted to give you the floor, give you an opportunity to talk about Birthright and why it's meant so much to you and why it's your favorite.
Yeah, Birthright, best origin story of Superman to me. What Mark Waid and Leno Yu did, I felt was so contemporary and so fresh when it came out, but like still to this day feels that way. It feels very relatable. It's got a tether to making Superman feel human and like someone you could see yourself in, but at the same time leans into the super heroics of it as well. So there's lots of like cool action and like fights and all the stuff that you want from comics, but it's like tethered with like a really good human core. And I just love this book. Like, so good.
Right on. That's why, it's resonated with me so much. I mean, just this idea of taking Clark at age 25 as he's trying to figure out where he came from and trying to figure out how he's going to fit into this world moving forward. It was deeply relatable, even if, you're not trying to figure out your alien origins. We're all trying to figure out, what made us who we are and who we're going to be moving forward. And this just tapped into that, I think, in a really engaging way. The art was fantastic. Now, I noticed you said Leno Yu. You might have noticed, because you got a sneak peek at the interview, before we sat down before I pressed record, I asked Mark, I said, how do you pronounce the artist's name? Because I've heard Lionel, and according to Mark Waid, it's Lenil. And that was the pronunciation that we went with in the episode. Because I did check with him. So in case anyone is like, oh, that's an interesting take on it. That is according to Mr. Mark Waid.
Oh, wow. Cool. That's good insight.
But the art is, right, like, and for you specifically as an artist, are there any specific panels or pages or scenes, sequences, like anything that you're like, oh man, like that's just aces?
I mean, so I already heard the interview, so you guys talk about a couple of them in the interview, so I'm not going to spoil that. Maybe we can talk about it afterwards. But I just like the way that he drew Clark in general. And like the way that he drew action was very kinetic. Like everything felt like it was moving, and it had like a cool angular look to it. So everything, and like a modernization to like say Jimmy looked very cool. He didn't have like the bow tie or anything. Like he kept and like Lois looked beautiful. Like he just had he has a very cool aesthetic that is so unique to him and something that I feel like isn't really associated with Superman. In terms of like when you think traditional Superman art, you don't really think like his kind of stuff, which makes me like it even more because it's so like different and like fresh, even to this day, even though the book is like 20 years old, which is crazy to think.
Yeah, very, very much so. So again, I know you had a sneak peek at the interview. What did you think generally?
Oh, it was awesome. Yeah, it was great. It was so cool to like listen to you guys talk. Yeah, it was just really cool to hear some of those insights for sure. One in particular, I definitely want to dig into, which I found really interesting.
Cool. So I'll play the interview, and he was, I have to say, he was very generous with his time and with just setting this up generally. I really appreciated him doing this, and so like I said, we spoke for just under an hour. So I'm going to play that now, and then you and I will come back and we'll unpack some of it. So without further ado, here is my interview with Mark Waid. Mark, welcome.
Happy to be here, sir.
I appreciate you taking the time to do this, and this is the second solid that you've done me. You were also an interviewee in my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, and I just want to publicly thank you on the record here for taking the time to do that. It added so much to the movie to have your perspective in it.
Oh, my pleasure. And it was a really good documentary. Enjoyed it quite a bit, and I think you really did, a service to, the medium, the stores, everything that you were trying to do.
That really means the world to me, so thank you very much.
Sure.
It's funny because you met my wife. She was there for the interview, and she was there for pretty much all of the interviews that I filmed for the movie. And after you left, she told me that she could tell I was a little nervous interviewing you. And I said to her, I was like, listen, I've been a fan of this man's work for most of my life. I said it was very surreal to me, to be in that room interviewing him. I said so, but hopefully I'll be a little bit more relaxed for this one.
It'll be totally fine. All good.
So again, thank you so much for doing this. We're here to talk about Superman Birthright. And I shared this with you when I met you for the documentary, and I've gone on record on this podcast in previous episodes as saying that it is hands down my favorite telling of Superman's origin. And I'm now going to go a step further because after this last reread a couple of nights ago, I'm confident in saying it's my all-time favorite Superman comic book stories. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for this story more than anything else. I have a lot of questions and everything, but I just thank you for this story.
No, that's very nice of you to say. I very much appreciate that. Thank you. That's what made it worthwhile, is that people really engage, especially people who, not you, but people who came up to me and said, I never liked Superman until I read this story, and now I get it. That was the best compliment.
I think that's one of the great strengths of the story is that, I grew up reading Superman and it worked for me in a meaningful way, but you also had that response from people who didn't necessarily have that familiarity with and affinity for Superman. So, it worked on so many levels. I have to share with you, and I'm not ashamed to admit this, there aren't that many comics that have brought me to tears over the years, but especially this time. And since I saw you for the documentary filming, my wife and I had a son. He's 1.5 today. And as a father now, I'll tell you, I was in tears during that opening sequence, and at the end of the book, it was exceptionally moving.
Thank you. I got to tell you, I because credit is not a finite resource, I'm happy to share that a conversation with Terry Moore at where were we? At Heroes Con, I guess, in North Carolina. One breakfast, talking about the story as I was building it, and he was the one who suggested the connection at the end. I thought that was just brilliant. That's great.
That's really interesting to know. And, I was thinking about it as I was reading it because, of course, Jor-El and Lara, they suffer this immense, unfathomable tragedy of losing their world and having to send their son out there. But there's this added layer of they don't know.
Right.
They don't know what's going to become of him. And so what a gift that you gave them at the end of the story, that they got to see he made it.
That was the whole point. That's all he need. That's all Jor-El and Lara needed to see, is that he made it. That's the way they could go to face their death in peace, or at least feel like, there's not that loose end. Yeah, it was funny. I mean, when we were talking about the story and talking about the things that you change and you don't change, because here's the thing. Obviously, Superman's origins has been told dozens of times, and there's little variations in some of the mythos, but it's basically the same story. But in the Superman that I grew up reading, the Silver Age Superman, the Bronze Age Superman, the Krypton knew about Earth. And that was just part of the continuity backstory, that they were aware that, and Jor-El knew he was sending the kid to Earth. And it's the same way in the movie. In the Donner movie, he knows he's sending him to Earth. And I thought about that, and I took it's one of the few things that I said I'm going to just break with the past. And I decided it might be better if he didn't know, if that extra layer of horror to it, that extra layer of pathos to the losing your child and jetting your child off into the unknown, is not knowing for sure. So it was a risk because, like I said, in continuity, he Jor-El knows, but in several previous continuities. But I think this works. I think actually even in the John Byrne reboot, he knew. I think this is the first time we've done a Superman origin where Jor-El just patently just shot him into space, just crossing his fingers and hoping for the best.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it worked, extremely well. It's funny that you mentioned, this whole notion of, how much Jor-El knows about where he's sending Kal-El, because I'm a massive fan of the television show Smallville, and that's informed a lot of my fandom. I'll be honest.
Sure.
And they took it a step further, and they actually took it to a degree that I wasn't totally on board with. But and again, I don't know how familiar you are with.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, they went so far as to say that Jor-El really selected the Kents. He had this journey to Earth as a young man, and it was interesting. And look, they had 10 years, so I think it's it's understandable they're trying to add new layers to it. But I felt that was a bridge too far. I think it's far more emotional when they don't know.
No, it's far more emotional, and that's important when you're dealing with Krypton, because Krypton is just such a super science environment, no matter what era you come into Superman. And Krypton is always the super science city, and science is their religion. So it's nice to be able to inject as much emotion in there as you can.
100%. And there's another aspect to Jor-El and Lara that I really appreciated. Throughout this story, there were a number of really clever and sometimes subtle reversals on the dynamics that you typically expect. And what I loved, especially as a dad, was that in this case, it was Jor-El who was scared and
Yes.
he wasn't sure. And it was Lara who was pragmatic. And she said, listen, this is his best shot. What motivated that? Because that resonated with me so much.
I always wanted to like Lara more than I did, because when you're a child and you're reading the Superman origin, and she says to Jor-El, Jor-El says, look, you can get in the rocket with a baby, and she says, no, my place is with you here. As a kid, you don't really understand the bond between, you're not a father yourself. When you get to be an adult, old enough to understand the responsibilities that parents have to their children from a parent's point of view, that's insane. That's coldly insane that she would say, I'm just gonna, no, I know I could be with the baby, but I'm gonna be with you instead. So I wanted a way to switch that up. I wanted some way to not only lose that, but also beef her up as a character. I mean, make her, make sure that there's enough strength in both characters that it's clear that he's not getting everything just from Jor-El. In fact, Lenniel was the one who made the brilliant thing about how she's got the spit curl, not Jor-El, but Lara's got the spit curl in this one that Superman has, and nobody's ever done that before or since, and I just thought that was great.
Oh, that's such a great touch.
Yeah.
That was actually, I wanted to speak to you about your penciler on this, Lenniel, and so I have the Birthright trade paperback, and there are excerpts from your pitch at the back of that, which was very interesting to read. And I actually have a couple of questions on that front.
Sure.
But it specifically notes that you requested Lenniel Yu as your penciler on this. What made him the right fit? I mean, obviously, seeing the finished product, I know, but from your perspective, as you were setting out to do this, why did you want to work with him on this?
He'd been on my radar for 6 or 7 years. He'd been on my radar since I was doing some X-Men stuff at Marvel, and I saw his work on Wolverine and was blown away, and told him on the phone at that time that he was calling Bob Harris's office at the X-Men editor's office for some reason, and I just said, give me the phone, because I want to tell him I really want to work with you at some point. So he was, he's on my radar. And then we started talking about who would draw this book. And DC had some suggestions, and all of them were fine artists, but the commonality was we had seen their Superman before. We all knew what their Superman would look like. And I thought, again, if you're going to try to modernize it and go for a brand new audience, you're not beholden to a Kurt Swan look or a Wayne Boring look. Go with somebody who can bring some heat to it, somebody whose Superman, we have no idea what that would look like. And so that's why I fought for Lenniel, and he just executed beautifully.
He was, what a fantastic choice. He was tremendous. There are, we could do a whole episode on his art in this, but there are a few moments that really, really jumped out at me. One of my, I think not only in this book, but one of my all-time favorite images in a Superman comic is when, Clark is at really his lowest point where, Lex has turned the public against him and he's ready to give up. And Lois, kind of knocks some sense into him, and he's flying and he's got the glasses in one hand and he's got the cape in the other. And that moment of just seeing the duet, like to see it literally represented, that duality between them. And then, he puts on the costume and and we have that full page, that splash page of him saying like hell, and he goes after them. What a powerful moment. That's
again, Leinil was brilliant about that stuff. Leinil also threw in some other touches that I was not I was unprepared for, but I thought were really cool. I remember one of them being the super subtle thing that there's a diving suit in Perry White's office, of all places in the New York City editor or the Metropolis editor's office, a diving suit. But he pointed out, no, that comes from the Adventures of Superman TV show. And then, okay, awesome, good tip. So Leinil was on game.
I'm so glad you brought up Adventures of Superman, because I recently watched the vast majority of the series for the first time. I filled in a major gap in my Superman fandom, and I watched it, and it was a magnificent experience. That touch with the scuba suit is wonderful. And I was actually thinking about Adventures of Superman when we were talking about Jor-El and Lara, because in the pilot episode of Adventures of Superman, I mean, that's a perfect example of not an emotional Jor-El. I mean, he's pretty much just like, all right, put the kid in the tin can and we'll send them off. But that's great. And then as far as the process with Leinil, I mean, how collaborative was it as you were moving forward through this process?
It was not as collaborative as some relationships, like with when I'm working with Chris Samnee on Daredevil or whatever, where we get to a point after a while you just have a shorthand with each other. So, and I can just give them vague directions as to here's the dialogue and here's the beats that you need to hit and go nuts on that. And Leinil was more comfortable with a finished script. But that said, he always had the freedom to change things up if he's got a better idea. Take a swing at it. If there's a better way of doing this, is there a better way of revealing this thing, then go with that. And he just exceeded my expectations at every turn.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, he was such a tremendous choice for this project. Continuing along about the pitch, and again, it says that there are excerpts, so I don't know how long the entire proposal was. There's a significant amount, it seems, in the trade paperback, but
I'm pretty sure that's most of it. I don't remember what it was, but the reason it was excerpts is because there was one paragraph that we took out at the 11th hour and I don't remember what it was, but it could have been read as a diss on somebody, and I don't remember what it was. It wasn't intended to be, but it was one of those things where if you read it, paranoically enough, somebody might take offense. So we lop that out, but I think it's pretty complete other than that.
Understood. Okay. No, that's really interesting to know. It's funny because I don't know how to describe it. There seems to be like a little bit of a tone throughout the pitch of wanting to assure DC that this wasn't going to be such a radical departure. And I was just wondering, was that something that, I mean, had DC given you a clear indication that was a concern of theirs? Was it something that you were kind of concerned about? Like, where did that kind of come from?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I remember. I do know that the marching orders were, well, here's the thing. At that point, the project had to be signed off on by two people. It had to be signed off on by Dan DiDio, who ended up being the publisher, and it had to be signed off on by Paul Levitz, who was the publisher at the time. And Dan was always expecting me to go so far afield and completely in brand new directions that I could just walk off a cliff, and he was expecting that sort of newness from it and that absolute change. Whereas I knew Paul would be resistant to that. So I was trying to play both sides, if you will.
Wow, that seems like a very difficult line.
It was a very difficult line to toe. And there were, I don't remember specifics, but I remember there being things that didn't get in because one or the other of them just was vehemently opposed. I don't remember specifically what they were, but it was a juggling act.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, from the reader's perspective, I thought it really struck such a great balance between, hitting a lot of those classic notes that you would want to see in a Superman origin story, but at the same time feeling very fresh and modern. If my math is right, I think I was 16 when it came out. So I was in high school, and I've read it now. I mean, I don't know, at least half a dozen times, and now I'm 34. And it's crazy to think that it came out as long ago as it did.
Boy, almost 20 years ago. You're right. Holy smokes. Yeah.
Yeah, but actually, on that note, one thing that struck me with my reread was there there are a few instances in the book that I wish I could say they felt dated, but sadly they weren't. Clark stops a school shooting, something that continues to be an issue. There was also something that I don't think this would have jumped out at me at the time, but in light of the past 4 years that we've lived through, really jumped out at me. And that's when, and you probably know where I'm going with this, where Lex, makes the claim that Superman is an alien, but he provides no proof. And Perry, is hounding Clark. He's like, you got to write the story. And Clark's like, well, but he didn't provide any proof. And Perry says, well, the fact that he says it alone is news. And that's very much what we lived through.
That's very much what we lived through. Yes. So, yeah, I don't want to just risk alienating some of your viewers by going on a political jag. So yes, let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And I'll be honest, I mean, I tend to stay away from that as well on the show, not because I don't feel it's worth discussing, but just because this usually is not necessarily the forum for it. But it really just jumped out at me, so I felt it was worth mentioning, and so that in particular, really made an impression. But on the note of the newsroom and Perry and the journalism side of this, one of the things that I so appreciated, and part of this is probably because my undergrad background is journalism, but even beyond that, just as a Superman fan, I loved that journalism wasn't just a means to an end for Clark.
No, it's something he was genuinely interested in. It's something that meant something to him. It wasn't just, I could be a fireman, I could be a policeman, I could be a journalist, because journalists are always, the given reason was always because journalism, journalists are going to be the first to hear about any disaster, any news, and so as Superman, that'll help me, and that was the excuse given in the comics. But I liked that Clark really embraced journalism as its own thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was something that I really appreciated, something that, a lot of times is overlooked. And on that note, this is, I think, the biggest picture compliment that I want to pay your work here, which is that there are numerous aspects to the origin story. The journalism piece is one of them that I feel are often taken for granted. They often happen in the origin stories because they're supposed to happen in the origin stories. Right. Yeah. And you took the time to explain why, and like why he would put on a costume with a big S on his chest and become a public-facing superhero.
That was everything to me. That was the whole purpose of the whole thing to me, is to basically to reintroduce Superman as if he'd never been done before, or if he'd been laying fallow for 20 years and nobody had published him. I really wanted anyone who, all they knew was that Superman is Clark Kent and he lives in Metropolis, and that's all they knew. I wanted them to be able to pick this up and understand Superman. So that's why we hit why he's wearing a costume, why he does what he does, what motivates him is such an important part of the book, and what motivates Lex is also an enormous part of the book. And those are things that you can't take for granted when you're writing. It can't just be, I mean, you can write a Superman story where he's doing the right thing just cause. You can't, you can write a Spider-Man story where he's doing the right thing just cause, but it's more meaningful if there's a personal connection to it, if there's a reason for doing what he does.
Yeah, 100%. And on the note of Lex, when we mentioned Smallville before, that was one thing that I was curious about, was the reintroduction of this past between Clark and Lex in Smallville. Was that an attempt at synergy? Was that something that you wanted to do on your own? A little bit of both? Where did that come from?
It was not from Smallville, oddly. It was from Silver Age Comics. It was from 1960 to about 1986, for 25 years. That was part of Superman's history, is that he and Lex grew up together in Smallville, and that the accident happened, and therefore Lex Luthor. And I cling to that. I cling to that because to me that makes their relationship so much more interesting. It tells me so much about Lex being a kid alone in a, and so smart that he can't even talk to people in Smallville. It's like he's Diane Fossey. He's trying to make his way through that. And Clark is the only human being in the city, in the town, who he can even stand, because the Kent kid kind of gets it. And Clark embraces young Lex because, again, if you're Clark and you can see things that, don't even have names because you're the only person who can see them. If you can hear the world in a way that nobody else can hear it, you can talk about that with Ma and Pa, and they'll listen as best as they can, and they're not dumb people, but it's not their world. But with Lex, he could finally be with somebody who could sort of understand what it was like to be different and what it was like to have abilities above and beyond, the ordinary people, and what that brought out. So that relationship is key to me, and it's also key to me. The thing that I changed about it was that in the Silver Age comics, Lex was trying to come up with the formula for life. He was trying to invent life in a small lab in Smallville nowhere in the 1940s, and he managed to succeed. But in that moment of glee when he finally, I have created life in my lab, he knocks over something, a fire starts, and Superboy comes by, and without even bothering to check out the situation, he just blows out the flames. And in doing so, he destroys Lex's experiment. When Lex then loses it and snaps at Superman, it's not, "You made me lose my hair from the chemical fallout of the accident." It's not that. It's, "I created life. I did something that no one on the planet could do, and you're jealous of me." He's already emotionally unstable kid anyway. That was the snapping point. You were jealous of me. You hate me, so I hate you for taking this away from me. And that became the foundation of their relationship all during the Silver Age. And I couldn't do that exactly because I didn't want there to be a Superboy in continuity here, because that was kind of actually a mandate from DC. They didn't want it, that they didn't want a Superboy career for the character, so I had to leave that out. So if he's only Superman, then how would that work out? What would that turning point be? And I kept the basic beats. It's Lex is doing an experiment. Lex is emotionally unstable. Lex is a jack-in-the-box with one note left to go. And Clark is his only friend. And he's doing this experiment. And Clark realizes this is a bad idea. And in Birthright, the difference being that in Birthright, Lex says, "Look, I found this green rock that's going to power this machine." And Clark has never dealt with kryptonite before. He never knew it existed. And suddenly he has that sort of horrible, weak feeling. And in that moment, Lex interprets that as Clark turning on him. Clark's looking at him like everybody else in town looks at him, like he's nuts, like he's crazy. And that's not really what happened. But Clark had come over to tell Lex, "I'm from another planet." In Birthright, Lex's big goal was, "I need to prove there's something else out there. I want, more than anything, to prove that there is life beyond Earth. There's life out there somewhere." So the irony of having your only friend be an alien and you don't know. In Birthright, it was set up that Clark saw that Lex was this close to just snapping, and he went over there with the intent of, "I'll tell you that everything you want is true, everything you believe is true, and here's how you know." But before he could do that, the kryptonite came out. Clark recoiled, and Clark made his key error, the same as blowing out the flames in the Silver Age and ruining the experiment. Clark still screwed up. Clark, in that moment, if he had just said, "Listen, there's a reason this is affecting me this way. I don't know what's going on, but I'm an alien. Here's what's going on." If he told Lex who he was in that moment, their entire history would have changed. And Lex conceivably would not have snapped. He may have, but he may not have. And so Superman in the Silver Age always had to deal with the guilt of, I did something stupid, and Lex kind of went over around the bend, and I bear some responsibility for that. And I wanted to recreate that. So that's the way it is in Birthright. He screws up. Clark screws up, and therefore Luther. Now, we can all look at it and go, okay, Luther probably would have turned into a villain anyway. It's not, and it's not like Clark did anything awful. It's just a momentary hesitation. But if you're Superman, you can't help but feel like there's a little bit of responsibility because the tragedy of that being that you've cost the world. There's a chance that you did something as a young man that cost the world the kind of genius that only comes around every 100 years. A genius that could have transformed the world for the better. And because no one's harder on Superman than Superman, right? So Superman's attitude is, I don't know that I could have saved him to go on the path of, the straight and narrow, but I certainly didn't help. So that was that. A long answer to a short question, but that was the Smallville stuff. It was really, it had nothing to do with the TV show, although it helped that it was something that a lot of people already knew who weren't familiar with, who were familiar with the TV show, but not with the comics. But it straight up came from the Silver Age.
Gotcha. And, knowing your knowledge and your love of the history of Superman, that's kind of what I figured, and that made sense. But just given the timing of this, when Birthright came out relative to the TV show, that was something that I was always curious about. But, it was so interesting to hear you lay that all out. And it plays so powerfully in the pages of the comic.
Thank you.
For all the reasons that you said. And, just this parallel that you established between Clark and Lex, where, Clark has all of these experiences where, especially when he's, traveling the world, and when he does reveal his powers, that reaction from people, that fear, and that's, right. That's what Lex sees from other people as well. So, to kind of have that, between them was really interesting, and yeah, real tragic end to, to their time in Smallville.
Yeah. It's like, Batman and Two-Face and Harvey Dent. It's like the best villains are the ones who were your friend. Dr. Doom and Reed Richards could have been friends. Those are the best, most compelling villains. The ones who just went the other, very similar, but took a different path.
Yeah, and I know certainly, there were certain parameters of continuity that you were working within here. But I mean, do you think there's a version of the story where it would work, where Lex really remembers Clark and recognizes him as Superman when they're in Metropolis, but, keeps that to himself because that's, power that he has, over Clark? And I mean, do you see any kind of version where that would necessarily work?
There is, but it doesn't sit well with me. I think that the idea that Clark's identity is a secret is a very important part of the mythos. And that's not to slag anybody who's, Bendis or anybody who's done Superman stories recently where he's revealed his identity to the world. That's, there's a whole bunch of different Superman, and every version is somebody's favorite. My favorite is that this is the mask that he gets to hide behind, and giving that knowledge to Luther. I don't know what you get out of it in the long run, because it's a great short-term story. But then he's going to, do everything he can to make Clark Kent's life miserable. And he's going to go after the Kents, and he's going to, go after the planet all the time. He's going to go after all the, So at that point, also there's no reason for Lex to not just tell that to the world if he knew.
Right. Yeah, no, fair enough.
Yeah.
I also, I appreciated, and just now as you were describing Clark as the mask, you pushed up your glasses, but what I loved about this, and I know this was part of your proposal, was that, Clark, the idea with the Clark Kent, mild-mannered Clark Kent, is it would be just that, mild-mannered. The idea isn't that he would be the Christopher Reeve, cartoon knocking over into everything, drawing that attention. I thought that was I really enjoyed that aspect.
He wants to be he wants to fade in the background. He wants to be the guy that you can't remember whether he was at the office party. That's the guy he needs to be as Clark, or else he doesn't function. Yeah. The more attention he gets, the easier it is to look behind those glasses and go, hey, wait a minute, you look Superman.
And there are a couple of great moments. So, kudos to you and to Laniel, because the art in particular in these scenes really, really jumped out at me, where Clark is interviewing with Perry, and, he has this moment where he speaks up and he stands up for himself, and he realizes, like, oh, I got to dial it back. And there's this small panel where he closes his eyes, And I mean, my take on it at least was, this resignation of like, "Ugh, I gotta do this," and he knocks over the pens. It's such a great moment.
It's a struggle for Superman to be Clark Kent. I really think it's a struggle for him to be Metropolis Clark, I call him. I mean, there's really three Supermen. There's Superman, there's Clark Kent, the Smallville Clark Kent, the guy who grew up with the Kents, the well-adjusted kid, and then there's sort of Metropolis Clark, who is the mask, who is the one with the glasses and and the mild-mannered nature, and just trying to sort of stay under the radar. And it's a struggle to be Metropolis Clark because you have to be on guard about everything you say and do every split second of every day.
Yeah, and the scene in particular where the rest of the Daily Planet staff, when they ditch him, and he can hear them with his super hearing, and he's sitting there alone at the table in that restaurant. I mean, it's it's heartbreaking, and his only sin is being a little dull and a little quiet.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad you picked up on that, because his loneliness is also, I mean, something that is very important to me, that I think is a very important part of Superman. The lonelier he is, the more interesting a character he is, because he's the last of his kind. And frankly, I mean, I'm not even keen on the Kents being alive. I personally think Superman works better without even the Kents being alive, because those scenes where Superman flies home and has pie with Ma and Pa and talks about his troubles and what do I do about Brainiac, and Pa Kent says something sage and wise. I mean, that's very fun and very familial and very humanizing, but it doesn't speak very well of Superman as the leading authority on how to deal with Brainiac or whatever. It doesn't. It infantilizes him a little bit, I think, and I don't like that.
Interesting. So, I mean, so that's an aspect of the character that I really do enjoy. And I think that's in large part informed by, growing up, in the Byrne era of the comics, and they were around, and they were there in Lois and Clark and for, most of Smallville. And so, I think that informs a lot of that for me, but
and I get why people like it, because again, I see why that works for people. It doesn't work for me, but that's a great example. The Kents being alive is a great example of one of the choices I made that was not, in other words, every choice I made, right, was with the intent of doing as little harm as possible to the legend, and trying to not to mess with things too bad. So in my world, Lex isn't a corporate businessman. He's a super scientist. So, but I understand people recognize him as, a good guy in Metropolis. In my world, Superman works better without Ma and Pa Kent, because he again, it's that thing from the movie. Again, the first movie, all my powers and I couldn't even save them. But they've been alive in the comics for, 35 years now, or whatever it's been. So I get that if I went against that grain, people would resist. And look, I was always playing that game of I don't want to change so much that people who are fans of Superman for the last 35 years, or at that point, last 20 years, 17 years, that they just, they had no use for it. They would pick it up and they would go, this is too different from the Superman I know. So if I'm humble enough to know that just because I don't like this element of the mythos, it doesn't mean it's wrong, or it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means it's a personal taste thing. So I have to be, with all of Birthright, I just had to be very careful to always separate out my ego and my own personal taste from the overall job, so that I didn't just make it my Superman and suddenly it's a comic you could have read in 1967.
I really respect that, and I too, I can see it from both sides, especially with respect to the Kents. And this is something that over the course of this podcast now that I've been doing for a little while, I've sort of kind of opened myself up to looking at different approaches to the Kents, and I certainly can appreciate the value in having Jonathan in particular pass at that moment as Clark is transitioning to adulthood, and like you said, from the first Superman movie, learning that lesson, such a critical lesson, that for as powerful as he is,
right?
So I do see it both ways.
It's not just the lesson; it's also the tragedy of it. It's that people talk about Superman as if he has no problems, if he's, nothing bad can happen to him or has ever happened to him. Well, no, he lost his home world, but he was too young to really remember. So you could argue that that's not that impactful. But the idea of losing his parents is a tragedy that we all go through at some point or another in our lives. And it just underscores, it's not just him learning the lesson, but it just underscores in general that there are things that even Superman can't fix.
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So, you've spoken about Lex and the Kents. Is there anything else that jumps out at you that if you didn't have any parameters to sort of work within, the direction that you would have wanted to take this origin story in?
I think those are the big ones. I think that those were the big ones. That everything else, I think I would have stuck with. I mean, frankly, I would have, if it were just me, I would have had him be Superboy when he was in Smallville. But that's, again, just me. Other than that, I don't think there was anything that I held back on, or any other. I don't think there was a place that I wanted to go that I wasn't allowed to go. So that all worked out just fine. The one thing that got sort of muddied is that in my mind, the cape was, with the S symbol, was the flag of Krypton. And the pushback I got from DC was, no, yeah, it's the symbol of the House of L. I said, yes, I know, but it can be both. People have family crests. It can be both. And so the idea that it was the flag of Krypton is something that just kind of gets buried, and kind of we lost that element, but that's okay. It's I think it still works as, we're passing something on to you. This symbol of this world that you've left behind. The reason I want it to be the flag of Krypton and not just a Jor-El insignia is because he's the last son of Krypton. He's not the last son of the L family. He's the last son of an entire planet. So having the flag of Krypton with him, I thought that worked. And but it didn't take. No matter what you do with origin stories, there's going to be stuff that takes, and there's going to be stuff that the readers don't take to as well. They didn't take very well to the idea that Superman can see things die. And this crushes him. That whole scene in there where he's talking about how living things just have a glow about them. They all, when you have Superman's super senses, everything that's alive has a certain glow to it that he can't explain because there's nobody else in the universe who can even see it. And when it goes away, it's just the ugliest thing in the world to him. It just curls us. It's just the ugliest, most gruesome, most horrible thing to see is that life aura around people just turn to black. And so that has a lot to do with his complete and utter reverence for life. And people didn't like it. People looked at it and they called it, soul vision. He's got soul vision. Isn't that cute? That's stupid. And that didn't take. So there's going to be stuff that takes and stuff that doesn't take. But I think by and large, if nothing else, the idea that the S means something, that it stands for hope. If they take nothing else away from this, that's the takeaway. That's the one thing that really stuck from Birthright.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, those specific touches that you were just describing, I thought they worked well in the story. And you also make Clark a vegetarian, and it if he can see that living aura of
right.
of people and animals, like it's natural.
Yes. Yeah. And the pushback was, well, the Kents were farmers. That's stupid. Well, I didn't say they were cattle farmers. They
right.
could be corn farmers. They could, it doesn't anyway.
Yeah, it could add a little level of tension, right? It's like, even if they were cattle farmers, it's like, and Clark doesn't even eat. Clark doesn't even eat the meat.
I'm sure there are vegetarian farmers. There must be, or children of farmers who are vegetarians. There must be. So again, that's one of those things that I threw out there. It didn't take. All right, I'll let that one slide. So, yeah.
One thing, I wasn't even really sure how to ask this, so I'll just share my perspective as a fan. As a fan of Mark Waid and as a fan of Mark Waid's Birthright, it always kind of bugged me that we had, yet another Superman origin story told in the comics not long after. And again, from the fans' perspective, it felt like Birthright didn't have the opportunity to really take root
Nope.
the way Man of Steel had.
Nope. Did not. Because, I mean, that was the intent and that was the goal. But about halfway through, the powers that be thought, not sure we like this story very much. So let's just call this an alternate version of Superman's origin. Hey, Jeff Johns, got a job for you. That's kind of how that fell out, which is kind of a shame because I was never. There's a period of DC basically in the 2000s where I was never really allowed to be part of the club the way I was in the 90s. I just simply wasn't allowed because there are certain people who were working there at the time in the 2000s who didn't care for my work. I mean, flatly didn't like my work. And so this is one of those cases where I was doing my best, but the guy in charge, not Paul, the guy in charge looked and said, I don't really like this. So, Jeff, we like you, Jeff. We love you, Jeff. Jeff, you do it. And I don't begrudge Jeff. I mean, and Superman's Secret Origin was a fun story. But I am a little sad that it happened about an hour and a half after Superman Birthright finished up its run,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally understandable. I enjoyed Secret Origin well enough, and I certainly I respect the work that those guys did. It just speaking for myself, it didn't resonate the way that yours did with me, and that just as a fan, that always kind of bugged me. But at the same time, right, we're almost 20 years out from Birthright, and we're still talking about it. And I would imagine. I mean, is this one of those works that you tend to hear a lot about from fans, like, when there are conventions or on social media? I would imagine that must be gratifying. Even
it really is to know if this, I seem to be blessed with this ability to write stuff that isn't terribly hot selling when it comes out, but ends up being evergreen. Like the Flash book, when I was writing Flash, it always was a mid-level book. I mean, mid-list book. It didn't do terribly well. It was okay, but people still talk about it, and that's terrific. So, same with Birthright. Same with a few other things that I've done. It didn't. Its success sort of outlived its original run.
I know we're nearing the end of our time here. I just wanted to
also, can you even see me anymore? I can't. It's so dark in this room. Am I just a shadow?
It did get a little darker. I can still see you though.
Okay.
I can brighten you up a little bit in post-production. I think we'll make it work.
Okay.
But I can still see you. And but I mentioned before some of these reversals, and we talked about Jor-El and Lara. Again, I know as much as you prefer the version of the story where the Kents are no longer in the picture. I thought you used Jonathan and Martha to great effect. And again, as far as another reversal, Martha was far more active in this story than she often is. Active on the UFO message boards, like it made so much sense.
That made so much sense to me. If you have a kid who wants to be an Olympic diver, at least one of those parents is going to be in the Olympic diving world, man. They're going to be on every message board. They're going to be part of communities. They're going to be doing what they can to get their kid to the Olympics. And Martha Kent's no different. I mean, she finds a baby out of a rocket ship. She's going to start poking around. And that made sense to me that she would be not a conspiracy nut. I mean, she's not crazy, but she was heavy UFO fan and UFO student. So I gave them, and they gave them a relationship that that was different than his relationship with his dad, Jonathan. Let me also say this. Actually, I didn't take Lex Luthor from Smallville. The one thing I did take from Smallville, which is to my mind Smallville's greatest achievement, is that until Smallville, the Kents were always grandparent figures. Yeah, they were his parents, but they were always in their 60s. They were always white-haired people who were bland vanilla and didn't really have personalities and didn't really, they were just, there was never any tension or conflict between parent and child. And for the TV show, for Smallville, to make the Kents young, and therefore they feel like real parents, and there's a real tension in that relationship between child and parent. That was inspired, and so I took that wholeheartedly.
Yeah, that's always one of the things that I loved about the Smallville TV series, that they were younger, they were vital, they were vibrant, they were active.
Yeah.
It was such a breath of fresh air, when the show started, to see that. It's like, wow, like this is really, a different dynamic to play. And yeah, in Birthright, I thought it worked great. In your pitch, you mentioned a great untold Martha story that you teased it. Is there anything there that you would share, or do you want to still hold that back?
I don't think there's anything wrong with basically, spilling it, which is basically, I just, in my back pocket, I've got a story where, teenage Clark Kent and Ma Kent end up in Area 51 exploring, and they run afoul of something, and suddenly the entire United States Army is after Clark Kent and Martha Kent, and they're on the run, and they're trying to figure out what to do without revealing who they are. I think that could be a really fun story.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Well, I guess, really now wrapping up and kind of building off of that, I guess a couple of little related questions here. One was, at the time, was there any hope on your part, or anything that, DC might have said that led you to think that you would have the opportunity to tell more stories within that Birthright timeline? Or was this always 12 issues self-contained and done?
It was always 12 issues self-contained and done. Nobody ever spoke to me about doing anything more in that sort of universe per se, because they had, they had their version of Superman that they liked, which is great. That's the one who's married, which again, I can't wrap my head around. It works for people. It's awesome that people love married Superman. That works for a lot of, I'm not going to knock that for a second, but it's just not, I can't wrap my head around it, because it gets back to the idea of loneliness being such an important part of his character to me. So there really wasn't a place for me to go. I was offered the Superman book 3 times in the aftermath of this. And every single time, 3 times, and every single time, Lucy yanked the football out at the very last second. There was always something where, okay, you're going to do it, and then I get the phone call the next day going, yeah, well, things have changed, or this person who quit, they decided they're going to come back. And so I was always this close. So I've sort of made my peace with the fact that I've maybe told all but one of the great Superman stories I still have to tell. And I still have one in my hip pocket, and I can't say anything other than to say that DC and I have been having really good conversations.
Oh, that's very intriguing. I will say, as a fan, I would love, and I know there are many others, people I know and others I don't, who I'm sure would love to see you do, a full-on. Right, obviously, I mean, of course, we have Kingdom Come, and you wrote Superman and JLA, but to see you do a full-on sustained run on a Superman book, or even just another Superman story, anything, would be wonderful. I hope that those conversations prove fruitful. I'll certainly be watching. It's really funny.
I'm pretty confident things will work out. Yeah.
That's really exciting to hear. That's because that was actually one of the things that I was going to ask you, about the potential of writing more Superman in the future. So, I mean, it sounds like that might be its own thing. I guess generally though, would you have any interest in writing, if the opportunity came about to do, say, a Birthright sequel, for example, where it's like a year 2 in the life of a young Superman? Is that something that would be appealing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it would be. So ask me again in 6 months, but yes.
I might be inviting you back on this podcast
All right.
at that time. It's fascinating to me. I love, this is now the second time we've actually had a conversation, and I always love talking to you. What's so interesting is that, talking about, your view on the Kents and on the marriage, we see the character, I think, in very different ways, because those are aspects that I really like. Yet you wrote my favorite Superman story. So
there's, again, it's the beauty of a character like Superman as I've learned to accept, is any version is somebody's favorite.
Again, you covered so much ground in those 12 issues. I loved, the take on Lois. I mean, you really, again, not taking anything for granted, you showed why, and there were so many great moments where you showed why he would fall for this woman.
Yeah.
I was just curious, were there things that you were like, oh, if I had 3 more issues, I would have done, I don't know, this with Perry or this with Jimmy? I mean, was there
Jimmy
stuff that
for
you
sure?
were like, oh, yeah.
Not specific, but I just know I would love to have spent more time with Clark and Jimmy, because there's a subtle distinction, and it comes from the radio show, actually. I don't even know they did it on purpose in the radio show, but I'm going to say they did. And I used it in Birthright, and it's something that very few people do. It's that everybody calls Jimmy Jimmy, except Clark. Clark calls him Jim. Nobody else does. And that is the bond they have. Like Jimmy looks at Clark as like, here's the one person in this entire newsroom who takes me seriously and sees me as an adult. And so I would love to do more with that relationship.
Yeah, that would be terrific. I do love that dynamic. Listen, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this. Again, as a fan of this book for, almost 20 years now.
Almost 20 years now.
It's to have the opportunity to talk to you about it and to ask these questions. I really appreciate it. I know you could do any number of podcasts, and I'm sure you get a ton of these requests. So I really appreciate this. Is there anything I didn't ask you about Birthright that you really wanted to talk about, or anything that you're like, I can't believe he didn't ask me that?
I don't think so, because I think I took us on enough bends and twists and tangents as we went that I think we covered pretty much everything. Yeah.
So this really is the last thing. Kevin Smith famously told the story about when he was working on a Superman movie with John Peters.
That was all Laniel. That was all Laniel. Okay. Giant spiders. I remember looking at that and going, oh, that's all people are going to see is that. But that's it. That's one of those gags that wasn't great at the time, but so much time has passed that nobody gets it anymore, so it's okay.
Yeah, no, it totally works. But no, I was always curious about that. Yeah. Well, unless there's anything else you want to say, I think that'll do it for us.
All right, terrific.
Thanks
for having me
so much. I really, really appreciate it.
You bet.
All right, there you have it. That was my interview with Mark Waid. So I have a couple of follow-ups, things that, for the most part, like I said before, I really did get to cover just about everything that I wanted to. There was one thing that I didn't mention, and then a couple of other things that I've thought about since then. But I wanna toss the ball to you first. Anything that you wanted to kind of pick up on?
Well, when you asked me about the images before, when I think Birthright, the one that sticks in my head is the one where he's like, that splash page where he's flying forward and he says like hell and his eyes are red. Like, and you guys talked about that. That's such a cool image because he looks tough and like epic, like. There's another one where he's flying through the city, and I think it's at the last when those like spider monster things are attacking the city, and it's just like a really cool. It's like a 3/4 shot of him like flying forward, and like just a really great look of determination on his face. Like the facial expressions he drew were so good, and also when Mark Waid was talking about how, which I had never even noticed this until he mentioned it, but that Lara was the one who has the spit curl. And not Jor-El. Like I have that. Yeah, I had never even like connected that before, and like it's very cool, very very cool.
Yeah, same here. It was one of those things, and he said it. I'm like, oh yeah, like of course. But yeah, sometimes these things just just don't register. The one thing that I didn't ask him, and it's funny, I did have some notes and I got through just about everything, but there was one that I didn't. But I could probably guess the answer. We talked about so many of the choices he made about what to include, but there was one thing he didn't include in this telling of the origin, and that's Clark being found by the Kents, like the rocket landing on Earth. And it's always interesting, right? Like what you include and what you don't include. But I mean, I would assume, aside from only having a certain number of pages and issues to work with, maybe he felt that that's been covered enough, and if he didn't necessarily have like a new spin on it, maybe it wasn't necessarily worth including. Or also, and I think this, if I had to guess, I would say maybe this is really more the true answer, that while it would have been cool to see, it wasn't really necessary for the story, the specific story that he was telling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I never even thought about that until just now that you don't actually see that. But like, what I do remember is that sequence where like you see the rocket flying and then like it kind of like morphs into a bullet that like his hand is catching, and that's a super cool like breakdown of panels. So I don't know if that was him or Laniel who like came up with that, but yeah, I think that was a very powerful way to connect it right through without having to actually show the rocket like hitting.
Yeah, I love that too. That stood out to me as well when I was doing my reread. It's like, oh, like that. It really is, just such a great way to kind of like just bridge, those parts of Clark's journey visually. Like it was, that was a really, really nice touch. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
One of the things that I asked him was, does he think that there's a version of the story that would work where Lex knows Clark's secret? when they're in Metropolis, but but that the dynamic would still work and he wouldn't out Clark and all of that. And as you heard, he that's not a take that he he was a fan of.
Yeah.
But I guess, and I didn't want to spend the time to to fully get into this, but I guess in my mind I go back to Lex and Clark's final scene in the series finale of Smallville.
Mm-hmm.
Right, where they have this confrontation in the destroyed mansion, and this is the first time that the two of them are face to face in years, right? Because Rosenbaum had left the show, and I felt like the tone of the scene between the two of them in that moment, to me, is the dynamic I would love to see explored, where there's antagonism, and they are not aligned. They are going to each be on their own path, but despite all of that, there's still this bedrock of their friendship and their shared history together. And I think when you watch that scene, Lex is encouraging Clark. Darkseid is looming, and Clark has to embrace his destiny and all of that. And Lex is one of the people who encourages him. He's like, you know what you need to do. He puts his hands on his shoulders like he always used to, and says like, you know who you need to be and what you need to do to save us. And Clark's last words to Lex are like, I'm sorry I couldn't save you. And I don't know. I feel like there's a way that a dynamic like that could work moving forward. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I agree. I agree to what you're saying. I mean, obviously it would be up to the writer to come up with a scenario where that would work, So like if Mark Waid personally doesn't feel that way, then like,
oh yeah,
obviously. But like, I kind of agree with him though that I like Superman's. Not kind of. I do agree with him that like I like Superman's identity being not public. You know what I mean? Like I think it adds a cool level of like relatability to him. You know what I mean? So that he can just have a regular normal life as opposed to, everyone knowing he's Superman. But yeah, I do think that in a version of what you're talking about could definitely work. As if Lex just keeps it to himself, for like long periods of time, for long stories,
Yeah. No, and I am in agreement. I mean, I wouldn't want the public to know. And as far as Lex knowing, I mean, I agree with Waid in the sense that, again, the way Lex has typically been depicted, it probably wouldn't be believable that he would keep it to himself. I agree with him on that. I guess in my mind, I just keep going back to that specific version of Clark and Lex from Smallville, and it's like in my mind, I can buy that Lex would keep that to himself because it's partly that knowledge is power, but it's also that despite the fact that they're enemies now, like they used to be best friends, and there's something there, so that's kind of what I was thinking about. But it was really interesting to hear him talk about Clark and Lex and just all the choices that he made generally. As you heard me say to him though, it was fascinating to me that he's not a fan of the Kents being alive.
Dude, that was the big thing that I wanted to talk to you about.
Yeah,
like,
go for it.
Yeah, well, no, because it's so funny because, like I agree with him on like everything he was saying except for that. And I just found that's like so interesting that like he wants Clark to be like a total loner, which like, I mean, I get that there's like an appeal to that, like the stoic kind of like loner hero, but like I never really thought of Superman as being that character. You know what I mean? So like, I always like his parents being around and like the family, like we were talking about Superman and Lois. Like I like the family aspect to him, like I like, if I had to think about it, like he's not a character that I would associate with being a loner, and that's not to say I don't like those type of characters, because I do, like it's just not, because even Birthright, he's not like a total loner, you know what I mean? So it was so interesting to hear Mark Waid say that like from his perspective, that's how he views him, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting, because like that wasn't what I read at all in that book,
That was so fascinating to me. And I know you heard the episode that I did with Rich Roney months ago now about the Superman 2000 pitch that Waid did with Morrison and Mark Miller and Tom Peyer, right? This rejected attempt to take over the Superman books at the turn of the century. And a big part of that was undoing the Lois and Clark marriage and erasing her knowledge of Clark's secret identity. And so I don't know if you kind of put that together. It's like this idea, I think this really does become clear, this idea of Clark as a loner. He doesn't have his parents. He, he doesn't have, this relationship. And, like we talked about in my discussion, with Wade, obviously there are all different takes on the character and they can all be valid. And if, you could tell a good story with it, it can work. And so much of what we like depends on what we grew up reading and watching, that informs so much of it. I guess trying to look at it as objectively as possible and just thinking about the character, I guess I feel like even with his parents and even with Lois, there's always going to be some degree of loneliness and not fitting in, just based on who he is and his alien origins. Not that he's a loner, but there's always some element of like, I'm the last of my kind, and certainly, growing up in Smallville and hiding that part of himself. So I guess I feel like the loneliness is still there. I don't feel that you need to, further take away that support system.
Well, it's funny because like loner type characters usually like go hand in hand with them being like just total badasses as well, right? Like you think like Batman, you think like any number of like Wolverine, like like any number of these characters that like are you think of as being those like aloof, tough loner characters, like tend to be like the too cool for school, like badass, but people seem to not want that with Superman. You know what I mean? They don't want him to be like super badass and too cool for school. So it was really, really interesting hearing him say that, because it was almost as if he wanted to like change the type of character, or at least how he sees him in his head is different than like most people view the character, So like, yeah, I just found it really interesting. Like, and I feel like he's been married to Lois for so long now that like if they took that away in the main continuity, I think that'd be really weird. Like I think
they did though in New 52.
Yeah, but it was like an alternate, like, you know what I mean? Like it was like an alt like take. It was like a new reboot kind of thing. I mean like if they hadn't get divorced or something. Like I'm saying like if they like continued the thread, I think that'd be super weird. And like I don't know, man. Like I also think that like that type of Superman that he was describing that isn't married, doesn't have his parents, like I think that works better if he's a younger character. Like if he's like in his 40s or 50s and he's this like like angry, like I just feel like the appeal wouldn't be as much, like because I think like with this kind of like long form storytelling, like you kind of have to make the characters change and evolve as time goes on, and to Mark Waid's, like obviously he's an amazing writer, like he didn't force what he want, like you know what I mean, like he did a really good job of like taking like how he saw the character mixed with what had come before and kind of like working with it, as opposed to just being like, no, this is, you know what I mean, like, so yeah, man, it was super interesting, like yeah, it's crazy.
Along those lines, it was so interesting to hear him talk about how, among the higher ups at DC, right? Like you had Dan DiDio pushing for new and different, and then you had Paul Levitz looking for the more, traditional take, and so to kind of craft a book that offered both, like we talked about, I think it's just such a fine line to walk. I'm sure there was a lot of pressure trying to say, because they're two very different objectives.
Yeah, no, I mean, Mark Waid, if you're listening, you hit a grand slam, man. This book is perfect. Like this is like a perfect comic book. I tend to usually fall on the category if it was like me and that like say like someone posed that to me and like one person was like be traditional, one person was like be new and different. I typically tend to lean toward new and different, just because like I think if you just start retelling the same crap over and over and over again, that's when people like there's just going to be a general attrition of like interest, you know what I mean? So like I definitely understand the want of like what Dan DiDio wanted to like go new and different and bold and crazy. Like I definitely understand that. And like, but at the same time I also understand Paul Levitz being like, we can't alienate the old, like it is this fine line you kind of have to walk, and I think he did it beautifully. Like he kept the tethers of what people recognize as Superman and added new and different cool things,
Yeah, no, for sure. And one other thing that didn't come up in my conversation with him, but I've been reflecting on this since I did that recording, and one other aspect of Birthright that really resonated with me, and I think even more now than in prior readings, it just really made me appreciate the importance of Clark's heritage to him. And I mean, yes, of course, the book generally, this idea of like, where do I come from? But I felt like it really, he just did such a great job of really making you feel for, what Clark was going through and wanting to know where he comes from. And I guess for myself, I always fixate on the Smallville and the Metropolis, but this book, I think more than most other comic book stories or any other comic story, like really made me appreciate the Krypton of it all, and why where he comes from is so important to him, and why it's so meaningful when he puts that crest on. Like it really hit home for sure.
And I prefer Mark Waid's take that the S is the flag of Krypton, not the House of L. Like I love that it's like that's the symbol for the entire planet, not just his family. You know what I mean? Makes so much sense to me. And I remember reading that the first time I read that book when I was like in high school or college, and like reading the back of that book with that interview with him in the back of the graphic novel when he mentions that. And to me, I just thought that was such a cool take. And I was shocked they didn't use that in the movies, Man of Steel. Like I was shocked they kept, I'm assuming it's because they wanted Zod to have a different symbol. Like I'm assuming that's why they did that, why they kept it that way, because like if they both had the S, it'd be kind of strange, right. I guess. But yeah, I thought that was just such a cool take. And like I liked the idea that his mom made the costume, but she made it that way because of what Kryptonians wore. Yeah. Right? It wasn't just like, here's your like bright suit with like underwear on the outside. You know what I mean? Like for no reason. Like I liked the idea that it like she was trying to mimic what Kryptonians wore in that holograph thing that Clark had. That was such a cool take as well.
Yeah, like I know that makes so much more sense, right? That both the symbol, being the flag of the planet, and also, again, that she had that inspiration. Mm-hmm. Because I think, it and it also kind of brings his worlds together in a really interesting way, right? Where it's, the design and the inspiration of the home world, but it's, the woman who raised him, who's literally, mm-hmm. putting it together for him and putting her own spin on it. Yeah, I thought that was really cool. Yeah, it made me, and as Wade was saying, like, he was disappointed that the idea of the S being the flag, like, never really caught on. But, it's still there in this story, and, you never know. It might be picked up again, down the line, yeah. Right? As the stories go. I
really wish they kept this as like the origin and continuity, because I remember reading Secret Origin, and I didn't. I mean, I know those guys worked hard on it, and I'm not trying to like badmouth it or anything, but like it felt like it was doing more navel gazing to the past and trying to like kind of like look on nostalgia with like the Silver Age stuff, and I never think that's a good idea. Like I always like when we were talking about pushing forward, like it felt like this Birthright was like a new, fresh, modern origin that ironically I think still holds up as like a modern, fresh origin. Like if you gave this to someone now, like nothing, with the exception of like smartphones, like I don't really know what would feel dated about it. Whereas like when you bring in like, the Legion of Superheroes and him being Superboy and all these like cornbally Silver Age things, like it just doesn't hold up to me as well. And that just might be a taste thing, because like I'm younger, I didn't grow up with the Silver Age stuff. I mean, I'm not, I'm in my 30s, but like I didn't grow up with the Silver Age stuff, so like this stuff just doesn't resonate. So maybe, but yeah, I just wish they kept this origin being like the official. It's my official one. It's my canon origin.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And actually, on that note, so this is the first of 3 episodes on digging for kryptonite in the month of April, examining Superman's origins. And I started with a special episode on Birthright because it's my favorite, and in my mind and yours, I know because we've discussed it, it's the best. Mm-hmm. After this episode, next week and then 2 weeks after that, there's going to be one episode on all of the pre-crisis tellings of the origin across time and media. And then we're going to do another episode on the post-crisis tellings of the origin across time and media. And my guest for both is going to be Rich Roney. He and I did a massive deep dive on the George Reeves Adventures of Superman TV series earlier on the podcast. As of this recording, he and I are in the midst of our homework for these episodes. I'm really interested because I've read most of the post-crisis ones, almost all of the post-crisis ones, but almost very few of the pre-crisis ones. So over the course of this reading project and viewing project, because we'll also be pulling in like the Fleischer cartoon and the George Reeves series and Lois and Clark and so on, Smallville. I'm
I don't know. I don't know if there's anything you can get out of Smallville. I mean, like it was just such a thin plot. Like, how could you get any content out of that?
I know, it just kind of came and went. It really had no staying power. But I'm really excited to kind of take a long view of this origin story and how it was built over these 80 years and how new layers kept getting added and continue to get added to the story. Some more effective than others. But I guess kind of circling back, you and I are in the same camp, and Wade is too. He said it in the episode that, we all wish that Birthright had taken root as the definitive origin, but it's like for us, and I'm sure other fans probably in our age group as well, who like that was the first one that like really hit home with them. It is, and it lives forever. That story. So,
well, what's your second favorite? If you do you have one that's off the top of your head? That'd be your second favorite.
Honestly, this is really in its own category, but what Grant Morrison and Frank Whiteley did at the start of All-Star Superman with that one page.
Really?
It's just so iconic, and it just boils everything down to these few basic, simple panels, but it's like, man, it captures it. But again, I would kind of put that in its own category. Like, to more specifically answer your question, and just within the realm of comics, right? Because if we open it up, I mean, obviously Smallville, but within the realm of comics, it's interesting because it's like I don't know how much I necessarily enjoy reading Man of Steel per se, but I appreciate what it did, and that set the template for the whole version of Clark and Superman that we grew up reading. So I think I probably would have to give the second spot to Man of Steel just in terms of what it did. But what about you?
Yeah, no, me too. It's Man of Steel. I probably like reading it more than you do based on what you just said. Like, I actually really do like Man of Steel. And yeah, it's I know I was just talking about nostalgia not being a good thing, but for me it's like that version of Superman is like so like iconic in my head, and again, like I thought it was like a fun take. Like, it wasn't dour and it wasn't like meandering or looking back at the past. It was like a new fresh take for the time, and like I always like when it does stuff like that. That's again when I go to Secret Origin, like Secret Origin's beautiful. Like I think Gary Frank drew that, right? Secret Origin. Yeah. Beautiful book. But like I just too much of it was referring to Silver Age stuff, like going backward to me, and it just like I don't like when things do that. Like, I would rather it go like forward, and that's why that one didn't like resonate with me as much, even though like it's gorgeous, like, but teach their own.
Honestly, I think that was ultimately the same issue that I had with it as well, and I've never been on board with the idea of Clark acting as Superboy.
Yeah, me neither.
So that really took me out of it. But actually, I have to amend my answer to your previous question, and I'm sorry that it didn't come to mind immediately. But For All Seasons.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But I will say within that, though, again, you can categorize these all different ways, because For All Seasons, I don't really look at it as an origin story in the sense of a Birthright or a Man of Steel. For All Seasons was more emotional and like more of these like little character vignettes than it was like, oh, we're going to retell his entire origin. It was really more about him leaving Smallville and making his way to Metropolis. So it's kind of in its own category, but that one is very near and dear to me. So I'm going to include it in this, and I would give that the number 2 slot, and then Man of Steel. With utmost respect to Man of Steel.
Did you read the Earth 1 books? I can't remember if you said you did or not.
So I read the Earth 1 book, the first volume when it first came out, and I'll be honest, I didn't really like it.
Because that one's very not John Byrne's Man of Steel. The movie Man of Steel, like, I feel like took a lot from that. So I just wasn't sure if that was. Like, I'm sure you're going to talk about it in your other books.
Well, and it's funny that's one of the reasons why I want to revisit it at some point, because I know that it does share a lot with Snyder's movies, and as we have discussed, I am a big fan of that. So I feel like maybe I would view the book differently now. That being said, I'm not covering that in these origin episodes, and I'm not covering All-Star Superman in these origin episodes. I'm really just focusing on the in continuity.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Tellings.
Gotcha.
Now, you can make an argument. None of these are, it's like what's in or out of continuity always changes. But my baseline for this, because I had to rein this in somehow.
What's intended for continuity?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
gotcha.
that's it. So like Earth 1 was meant to be its own thing. All-Star meant to be its own thing. And it's going to be, we're going to get to it on the podcast eventually. But for this, we're just sticking with stuff that at the time was intended to be canon. So that's the plan.
Cool. I'm looking forward to hearing it for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. So is there anything else that you want to say before we sign off?
Mark Waid, you kicked ass. Awesome book. Favorite comic of all time. Hope you get to write more Superman soon.
That would be amazing. So Ken, thank you very much I really appreciate you jumping on here and doing this post-mortem with me. It was really a lot of fun. And it, I don't typically do this with episodes, right? So to record something and then, kind of do another little piece following up was a lot of fun. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And where can people find and follow you?
You can find me on Instagram at V KEN MARION and Twitter at V K MARION. And I'm repped by Modern Mythology Modern Mythology Comic Art. Sorry, I always do that. Put the book in there. And you can go to their website and check out original art for sale and commissions. And I think that's pretty much it.
Right on. Well, thank you, Ken. Thank you to everyone who listened to or watched this episode. Again, my great thanks to Mark Waid for participating on this podcast. Be sure to come back for our Origins episodes. It's going to be a big month on the podcast, and I hope you enjoy. Until then, remember, it's about what you do. It's about action. Digging for Kryptonite is a Flat Squirrel production. Art by Greg Schiegel, music by Basic Printer. If you like what you heard, be sure to listen to My Comic Shop History, available on most major podcast platforms. Sign up for exclusive additional content, including the Digging for Kryptonite companion podcast at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato, and watch my documentary film, My Comic Shop Country, out now on Apple TV and Amazon.